The morning of June 22nd, 1944, is already hot on Saipan. The kind of heat that sits on a man's shoulders like a second uniform, wet, unmoving, pressing down to the jungle canopy in thick curtains of air that smell of coral dust, rotting vegetation, and something older. Something the Marines have learned over the past 9 days of fighting, not to look for too directly. Private First Class Guy Gabaldon is 19 years old. He is not large. He is not an officer. He carries no special equipment beyond a rifle, a handful of ammunition, and a working knowledge of Japanese, a language he absorbed not in any classroom, not through any military program, but in the living rooms and backyards of a Japanese-American family in East Los Angeles who took him in as a teenager when his own home no longer held him. He sleeps in their house. He eats their food. He learns, without intending to, how to move through a culture not his own, how to listen, how to speak, how to earn trust through presence rather than force. None of this appears in any official Marine Corps manual. What happens next on this island, in the caves and jungle shadows north of Garipan, will not appear in the official record for years either. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you're watching from today. But it happened, and the men who surrendered, more than 400 of them, some armed, some wounded, some simply exhausted past the threshold of resistance, will spend the rest of their lives knowing that a single American, barely out of adolescence, walked into the darkness to find them, not with a company behind him, not with armor at his back, alone, with words. To understand how that morning becomes possible, you have to understand what Saipan is, what it means, and what has already been spent to reach it. The Mariana Islands sit in the western Pacific like a curved spine of volcanic rock, stretching roughly 500 miles north to south. In 1944, they are not merely geography. They are arithmetic. American military planners, Admiral Chester Nimitz chief among them, understand that the B-29 Superfortress, the longest-range bomber the United States has ever produced, requires a launch platform within 1,500 miles of the Japanese home islands to make sustained strategic bombing campaigns viable. The Marianas provide exactly that. Saipan, at roughly 1,400 miles from Tokyo, is the keystone. Taking it will not be clean. The island is roughly 14 miles long and 6 miles wide at its broadest point. It rises sharply from its western beaches into a central spine of ridgelines and then drops again toward the northeast, where the terrain fractures into limestone plateaus, sinkholes, and cave systems that have, over millennia, been carved by water and wind into a natural fortress. The Japanese garrison, under Lieutenant General Yoshitsugu Saito, understands this terrain intimately. They have had years to prepare. The island has been Japanese-administered since 1920 under a League of Nations mandate, and in the years immediately before the American invasion, it has been significantly fortified. Gun emplacements set into hillsides, ammunition cached in caves, defensive lines drawn across every logical avenue of approach. The garrison numbers approximately 30,000 troops. They include Imperial Army infantry, naval ground forces, and a civilian population of perhaps 25,000, Japanese settlers, Korean laborers, and indigenous Chamorros, whose presence on the island will complicate every phase of the battle in ways the invasion planners did not fully anticipate. The American landing begins on June 15, 1944. The 2nd and 4th Marine Divisions go in across the western beaches in the pre-dawn hours, supported by a naval and air bombardment that has been ongoing for 2 days. The reef offshore forces a landing craft to run long distances under fire. The beach itself is narrow and exposed. Within the first 20 minutes, the Marines take casualties in the hundreds. By the end of the first day ashore, the beachhead is established, but the price is already severe. Roughly 2,000 Americans dead or wounded in a single afternoon. Among the units coming ashore in this first wave is the 2nd Marine Division, and attached to one of its regiments, in a role that begins as a straightforward combat interpreter and becomes something else entirely, is Guy Gabaldon. His path to this beach is not a conventional one. He was born in Los Angeles in 1926, the 7th of 8 children in a Mexican-American family living in the Boyle Heights neighborhood, a part of the city that in the 1930s is dense, multilingual, economically precarious, and, in its own fashion, extraordinarily cosmopolitan. His parents struggle. The family fractures under the pressure of the Depression years. By the time Gabaldon is a young adolescent, he is spending less and less time in his own home and more time with the Nakano family, neighbors, friends, people who feed him and shelter him with a steadiness his own circumstances cannot provide. The Nakano family, and particularly the two Nakano boys, Lane and Lyle, who become effectively his brothers, speak Japanese at home. They observe Japanese customs. Their household operates, in its rhythms and textures, within a Japanese cultural framework, even as it exists physically in the middle of Los Angeles. Gabaldon absorbs this without formal instruction. He hears the language daily. He learns it by immersion, the way children learn any language, through repetition, through social need, through the desire to be understood by the people around him. When the war comes, the Nakano family, like virtually every family of Japanese descent on the West Coast, is removed to an internment camp. Gabaldon, who is not Japanese, remains in Los Angeles. He enlists in the Marine Corps in 1943. At 17 years old, lie about his age to pass the entry threshold. His language ability, when it is eventually noted by his unit, is an informal asset rather than an official qualification. He has no formal training as an interpreter. He is simply a teenager from East Los Angeles who happens to speak Japanese well enough to be useful and who has, beneath his youth, an unusual quality, a willingness to move toward danger rather than away from it, particularly when he believed that what waits on the other side of the danger might be something other than a fight. This quality is about to be tested in ways that no training will prepare anyone for. By the time Gabaldon arrives at the line in late June of 1944, the battle for Saipan has already consumed 9 days and enormous quantities of men and material. The western coast, including the town of Garapan, has been fought over block by block. The central ridge lines to Pachow, the highest point on the island at nearly 1,500 feet, have been stormed and taken at tremendous cost. The fighting has a quality that characterizes Pacific Island combat at its worst: close, confused, exhausting, conducted in terrain that rewards defense at every scale. The Japanese position, however, is deteriorating. The American perimeter is expanding steadily northward. General Sato's forces are being compressed toward the island's northern third, the Tanapag Plain, the Marpi Point Plateau, the final ridges above the sea. Supply has been severed. Reinforcement is not coming. Saito himself knows, with a clarity that his dispatches to Tokyo make plain, that the island is lost. What remains is the question of how it ends. For the Japanese troops and civilians compressed into the island's northern reaches, this question carries a weight that is specifically cultural in character, and understanding that weight is essential to understanding what Gabaldon is about to attempt. The Imperial Japanese military doctrine of this period is built upon a conception of surrender that treats it not merely as military failure, but as a form of moral annihilation. The Senjinken, the field service code issued by War Minister Hideki Tojo in 1941, is explicit on this point. A soldier who allows himself to be taken prisoner has, in the code's framework, ceased to exist as a person deserving of consideration. He has dishonored his family, his emperor, his ancestors. Death in battle by grenade by any available means is preferred, indeed required, over the disgrace of capture. American forces in the Pacific have encountered the practical consequences of this doctrine repeatedly. At Tarawa in November of 1943, the garrison of roughly 4,600 Japanese and Korean laborers produces fewer than 17 prisoners, and most of those are taken unconscious or severely wounded. At Kwajalein in February of 1944, similar ratios hold. The pattern is consistent enough that American commanders have largely stopped expecting surrender as a significant operational factor in Pacific combat. The Marines fighting northward through Saipan carry this expectation with them. The caves that pock the limestone plateau above the beaches are not primarily understood as sites of potential negotiation. They are understood as fortified positions requiring reduction by fire and explosive. The standard method is well established. Call for position to be cleared, advance under covering fire, use grenades and flamethrowers to clear the interior, move to the next position. It works. It also kills everyone inside. Gabaldon has been watching this process for 9 days. And he has been doing something that no one in his chain of command has formally authorized, and that most of his fellow Marines regard with a mixture of admiration, concern, and frank disbelief. He has been going out at night. The first time, it is almost impulsive, or at least he would describe it that way later, in the interviews and memoir accounts that eventually piece together the outline of what he does over these weeks. He is positioned near the front lines, close enough to the Japanese perimeter to hear voices in the darkness. He knows the voices. He understands what is being said, and he decides without orders, without a partner, without a plan beyond the words themselves, to walk toward them. He carries his rifle. He carries a pistol. He carries, in the only language the men in the darkness speak fluently, a message. He tells them in Japanese that their position is surrounded, that American forces are many and their supplies are not coming, that the war on this island is already decided, that they can come out alive or they can stay and die, and that the choice, which their own military doctrine has told them does not exist, is in fact theirs to make. The first night, he brings back 2 prisoners. His sergeant looks at him with an expression that is not quite comprehension. He goes out the next night. He brings back more. The numbers accumulate with a consistency that no one in his unit has a framework for, not because it is militarily unprecedented for enemy soldiers to surrender, but because the mechanism is unprecedented. A lone teenager. No backup. Speaking Japanese learned in a neighborhood in Los Angeles. Walking night after night into the dark. By the time the battle reaches its climax in the final days of June, Gabaldon has developed something that might be called a method, though the word implies more formality than the reality contains. He selects positions where Japanese soldiers are known or believed to be sheltering. He approaches close enough to be heard. He calls out in Japanese. He identifies himself, an American alone, offering terms. He tells them the truth about their military situation, which by this point in the battle is simply the truth. The island is lost, reinforcements are not coming. Death is the only alternative to the choice he is offering. Most of the time, nothing happens. Silence or fire. But sometimes, with a frequency that begins to alter what his fellow Marines understand to be possible, someone answers. The morning of June 22nd is different from the nights that precede it, not in method but in scale. Intelligence has reached the Marine lines about a concentration of Japanese soldiers, both military and civilian, sheltering in and around a cave complex north of Garapan. The numbers are unclear. Estimates range widely. What is clear is that the position, when it comes time to clear through standard methods, will produce casualties, American casualties in the approach, Japanese casualties in the reduction, and almost certainly civilian casualties from among the non-combatants believed to be present. Gabaldon does not receive an order to go. He is not dispatched by his commanding officer on a formal mission with defined parameters and authorized support. What he does in the way he's been doing it, as an individual decision, made in the pre-dawn hours, carried out before the rest of his unit is fully aware of what he intends. He approaches the cave complex alone. He calls out. He tells them he is alone. He tells them he is not there to kill them. He tells them, in the Japanese that the Nakano family taught him in a living room in Los Angeles, a decade and a continent away from this limestone hillside, that they can come out and live. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. What happens next takes time. It is not immediate. It is not clean. It is a process, a negotiation conducted in the dark, through stone and fear and the accumulated weight of a military culture that has spent years telling these men that the thing Gabaldon is offering them does not exist. But they come out. The first few emerge cautiously, hands visible, eyes uncertain, moving in a particular way of men who are not sure whether the promise they have been given will hold the moment they step into the open. Gabaldon holds his position. He keeps talking. He tells each man who emerges to tell the next one. He uses the social dynamics of the group, the way that one man's survival, witnessed by others, becomes an argument for their own, as a tool. More come out, then more. By the time the process has run its course, Gabaldon is standing on a hillside in the morning heat of Saipan, with approximately 800 Japanese soldiers and civilians around him. Later accounts will revise this figure. The official record will settle on a number closer to 800 for the total of prisoners attributed to Gabaldon across his full time on the island, with the single-day figure from this operation given variously as between 400 and over 500. The precise count is contested in the historical literature. What is not contested is a fundamental reality. One American, armed with a rifle, a pistol, and a language, has just produced the largest individual surrender of Japanese forces in the Pacific War. He is 19 years old. He has been awake all night. He now has to figure out how to move several hundred people through active combat lines to an American position without getting them, or himself, killed in the process. The practical challenge of what comes after the surrender is, in its own way, as remarkable as the surrender itself. Gabaldon is alone. His prisoners, and this word requires qualification, because many of the people around him are not soldiers at all, but civilians, including women and children who have been sheltering with the military force, are not restrained. They are not disarmed in any formal sense. They are present because he had persuaded them to be present, and they remain present because, for the moment, the logic of his argument still holds. He has to move them. He knows, with the practical knowledge of a man who has spent the past 9 days at the front, that the route back to the American lines passes through terrain where trigger fingers are understandably quick, where a large group of Japanese-speaking people moving in the pre-dawn hours might not be immediately distinguishable from an armed assault, where the chances of a catastrophic misunderstanding are not trivial. He moves ahead of the column. He signals. He identifies himself. He gets word through that he is coming in, that he is bringing prisoners, that the column behind him is surrendered and not hostile. He brings them in. The Marine officers who receive them stare for a long moment at what is in front of them. Hundreds of Japanese soldiers and civilians, led in by a single enlisted man who is bleeding from a wound he has sustained at some point during the approach, who is exhausted past the point of coherence, and who seems, to the men watching him, to have done something that their understanding of this war, of this enemy, of the physics of what is and is not possible in Pacific combat, had told them could not be done. His commanding officer, Lieutenant Colonel William Gildea, will later write that when Gabaldon came in with his prisoners, the sight was simply unbelievable. Not a qualified unbelievable, an absolute one, the kind that requires a man to stand still for a moment and reassemble his understanding of what he has just seen. The broader battle for Saipan continues for another 3 weeks after the morning of June 22nd. The island is not declared secure until July 9th, 1944. The final days contain some of the most brutal combat of the entire Pacific campaign, a banzai charge launched in the early hours of July 7th by General Saito, who has already sent his farewell message to Imperial General Headquarters, and who will die by his own hand before dawn, produces the largest Japanese infantry attack of the Pacific War. Approximately 3,000 Japanese soldiers surge through the American line south of Tanapag, driving deep into rear areas before the attack is broken at tremendous cost to both sides. The civilian tragedy at Marpy Point at the island's northern tip unfolds in these same final days. Japanese soldiers and civilians, pressed to the island's edge by the American advance and convinced by years of propaganda that American captivity means torture and death, choose to die rather than surrender. They jump from the cliffs above the sea. Suicide Cliff, the Americans will call it, or wade into the water until they cannot stand. American loudspeakers broadcast surrender appeals. American ships move below the cliffs trying to retrieve those who jump and survive. It is not enough. The images from Marpy Point will circulate through the American command and eventually reach the public. They are, for many of the officers and men who witnessed them, the most disturbing thing they have seen in the entire war. Not because they involve combat, but because they involve the absence of it. Because the people dying are unarmed. Because the appeals being broadcast at them in Japanese are true, and the people hearing them do not believe that they are true, and there is no way to close the distance between the truth and the fear in time. Gabaldon's achievement, viewed against this backdrop, takes on a dimension that pure military accounting does not capture. He did not simply add a number to an order of battle. He demonstrated, in the most direct way available, that the propaganda was wrong, not through argument, but through presence, through the fact of his own body, alone and unarmed in any essential sense, standing at the entrance to a cave and offering something real. Through the Japanese he had learned in someone else's home. The Marines award Gabaldon the Silver Star for his actions on Saipan. The citation is carefully worded, acknowledging what he did while navigating the institutional awkwardness of formally recognizing conduct that had never been authorized, that violated every protocol of combat operations, and that worked anyway. Years later, after the story has been told and retold, and eventually made into a film, Held to Eternity, released in 1960, with Jeffrey Hunter playing Gabaldon, a re-examination of the record will conclude that the Silver Star had been insufficient. In 1960, the award is upgraded to the Navy Cross, the second highest decoration the Naval Service can bestow. There are Marines who believe, and have said so on the record, that it should have been higher still. There's a quality in what Gabaldon does that resists easy categorization, and this resistance is worth sitting with for a moment, because it points towards something the standard account of his story tend to skip past in their movement toward the dramatic numbers. He is not operating on a theory. He is not the product of a psychological operations program, not a trained negotiator, not a specialist in surrender facilitation. There is no doctrine behind what he does. There is no manual. There is, in fact, no official sanction. What there is a boy who grew up between cultures, who was, in the most literal sense, not entirely from anywhere, who had absorbed Japanese not as an academic achievement, but as a survival skill in the social world of his adolescence, who had learned to exist within a Japanese family's emotional register without fully belonging to it or being excluded from it. Who knew, from lived experience rather than from training, that the people on the other side of the language barrier were people? This is not a small thing. In the Pacific War of 1944, on both sides of every line, the psychological machinery of combat depends heavily on the dehumanization of the enemy. American propaganda images of the period are explicit in this. The Japanese enemy is rendered as insect, as rodent, as something outside the category of human response. Japanese propaganda performs the same function in reverse. Both systems produce soldiers who are more effective in combat, precisely because the person they are killing has been removed from the category of person. Gabaldon had not received this education cleanly. He had grown up in a Japanese-American household. The enemy, for him, had a face, several faces, belonging to the Nakano family, to the neighbors of his East Los Angeles childhood, to a community of people he had watched be removed from their homes by a government he served. This did not make him sympathetic to the imperial military cause. He fought, he killed, he was wounded, but it meant that when he stood at the entrance to a cave and called into the dark, he was not calling into an abstraction. He was calling to people. And something in the way he called, in the texture of his Japanese, in the absence of contempt, in the simple human reality of one person speaking to another, landed differently than the standard surrender appeals that had been producing, across 4 years of Pacific combat, almost nothing at all. The men he brought out of those caves survived the war. This is a fact that deserves to rest for a moment in its full weight. In the Battle of Saipan, the Japanese garrison of approximately 30,000 troops produces fewer than 1,000 prisoners. The rest die in combat by their own hand in the final banzai charge at the cliffs above the sea. The ratio of dead to captured is one of the most extreme in the documented history of modern warfare. The several hundred men and civilians who surrendered to Guy Gabaldon on the morning of June 22nd are among the small fraction of the garrison who lived to see 1945, to see the surrender on the Missouri, to go home, to whatever home remained after everything, and to carry with them the memory of a young American who had walked out of the dark alone and offered them a choice. Some of them, in the decades after the war, sought him out. There is a particular quality to those accounts. Men traveling from Japan to California to find the person who had, in the most direct available sense, given them their lives, that history's larger machinery tends to flatten into sentiment. It is not sentiment. It is a specific weight of a specific debt, owed by specific people to a specific man, for a specific morning in the summer of 1944. Gabaldon spent much of his post-war life in Mexico and later in the Pacific, working in various business ventures, raising a family, staying connected to the Japanese communities he had known since childhood. He was not a man who spent his later years trading on his wartime reputation. The opposite, if anything. He was frustrated for decades by the gap between what he believed he had done and what the official record acknowledged, and he fought, quietly, persistently, in the manner of a man who does not require an audience to have the record corrected. The Navy Cross upgrade in 1960 was a partial satisfaction. The film the same year was a more complicated one. Hollywood compression producing a version of the story that was recognizable but not quite right, the kind of adaptation that honors its subject by making him larger and, in doing so, makes him somehow smaller. He died in 2006 at 79 years old in Virginia Beach. There's a question that runs underneath the standard telling of this story, under the numbers and the awards and the film adaptation and the Navy Cross, that is worth naming directly. It is not, primarily, a question about Guy Gabaldon's courage. Courage, in the context of what he did, is almost too small a word, too narrow, too static, too focused on a single attribute of willingness to risk death, which he had in abundance but which alone would not have produced the outcome. Marines who threw themselves on grenades had courage. Men who charged machine gun positions had courage. What Gabaldon did required courage in something else, something for which the military vocabulary of 1944, and perhaps of any period, does not have a clean term. Call it imaginative empathy. Call it cultural fluency. Call it the specific knowledge that comes from having grown up close enough to another people's way of being human that you can speak to them in a register they recognize as genuine. Whatever it is not transferable by training. You cannot manufacture it. You cannot issue it. You cannot write a doctrine around it. It emerged from particular circumstances of one boy's childhood in one neighborhood of one city, from the particular grace of family who took him in, from the particular accident of linguistic absorption, from a particular way that living inside someone else's culture, without fully becoming it, can teach a person things about the distance between people that most people spend their whole lives not knowing. The Japanese soldiers in those caves were going to die. The arithmetic of their situation was complete. There was no rescue coming, no relief column, no imperial counteroffensive that was going to change the outcome on Saipan. Their death was as close to certain as anything in war can be. And a teenager from East Los Angeles walked up in the dark and changed the arithmetic. Not because he was invincible, not because he was fearless, because he spoke Japanese, because he meant it when he said they could live, because the people in the dark could hear, in the way he spoke, that he was telling the truth. There is a footnote to this story that the larger narrative tends to obscure, because it is quieter than the main event, but perhaps more revealing. Gabaldon's approach to the cave complex on June 22nd was not sanctioned. His commanding officer did not send him. His unit was not positioned in support. He went, as he had been going on the nights before, because he decided to go, because he had been accumulating evidence, night by night, that the thing he was doing worked, and because the intelligence about the cave complex had reached him, and he had done the calculation in a way that 19-year-olds sometimes do the calculation, quickly and without sufficient attention to the ways it could go wrong, and had decided that the potential outcome justified the risk. This is worth noting not to diminish what he did, but because it captures something true about how certain kinds of extraordinary things happen in war. They do not happen because the institution reaches down and enables them. They happen because an individual, operating at the extreme edge of what their institution has authorized, decides to push slightly past that edge, and is right, by some combination of skill and judgment, and the kind of luck that only reveals itself in retrospect as something other than luck. If Gabaldon had gone to the cave complex on June 22nd and not come back, the story would be a tragedy about a reckless teenager who disobeyed orders and died. The same action, the same decision, the same night, and the outcome determines whether history reads it as recklessness or as something else. He came back. He brought 400 people with him. And because he came back, we get to call it what it was. The island of Saipan today is an American Commonwealth territory, a small place of beaches and resorts, and a particular quiet of land that has been deeply traumatized and has taken decades to grow a new surface over the trauma. The caves are still there. Marpy Point is still there, a memorial site now, with an observation platform above the cliffs from which, on clear days, you can see the water below where the dead went into the sea. There is a memorial to Guy Gabaldon on the island. There are memorials in the United States. His story appears in histories of the Pacific War, in studies of psychological operations, in discussions of cultural competency in military contexts, in occasional documentary or anniversary piece. But the truest memorial is harder to locate and does not appear on any official list. It is the fact that several hundred people who were going to die did not die, that they went home, that some of them had children, and their children had children, and those children are alive somewhere now. Go about the ordinary business of being alive, in the world that exists on the far side of a June morning in 1944, when a boy from Los Angeles walked up to the cave alone and called into the dark in a language he had learned in someone else's home. And the dark answered. The island of Saipan today is an American Commonwealth territory, a small place of beaches and resorts and a particular quiet of land that has been deeply traumatized and has taken decades to grow a new surface over the trauma. The caves are still there. Marpy Point is still there, a memorial site now, with an observation platform above the cliffs from which, on clear days, you can see the water below where the dead went into the sea. There is a memorial to Guy Gabaldon on the island. There are memorials in the United States. His story appears in histories of the Pacific War, in studies of psychological operations, in discussions of cultural competency in military contexts, in the occasional documentary or anniversary piece. But the truest memorial is harder to locate and does not appear on any official list. It is the fact that several hundred people who were going to die did not die, that they went home, that some of them had children, and their children had children, and those children are alive somewhere now, going about the ordinary business of being alive, in the world that exists on the far side of the June morning in 1944, when a boy from Los Angeles walked up to a cave alone and called into the dark in a language he had learned in someone else's home. To fully appreciate what that survival meant, it helps to trace the arc of what those men returned to. Japan in August of 1945 is a nation in the condition of absolute ruin. Its cities burned, its navy sunk, its army shattered across a dozen island campaigns. Its civilian population, living on rations that by the final months of the war have been reduced to levels that nutritionists today would classify as starvation. The men who surrendered on Saipan, held in American prisoner of war facilities, were, by the bitter irony of their situation, among the better-fed Japanese subject of the final year of the war. They were alive. They were present. When the surrender came and repatriation began, they went home to a country that needed every living person it could find simply to begin the work of rebuilding. Some of them never reconciled the fact of their survival with the culture they had been raised inside. The Senjinken did not simply vanish from a man's interior life because the war ended. There were former prisoners who returned to Japan and found that the stigma their training had promised them, the social death that surrender was supposed to bring, was real in certain communities, certain families, certain silences that never got filled in. The shame was not universal, but was present, and it added a particular weight to the already enormous burden of coming back from a war that had ended in national catastrophe. Others found their way through it. Japan's post-war reconstruction, the extraordinary economic recovery of the 1950s and 60s, the transformation of a devastated imperial nation into one of the world's leading industrial economies, was built on the labor and ingenuity of the generation that survived the war. Some of the men who walked out of caves on Saipan in the summer of 1944 participated in that rebuilding. They worked in factories, in agriculture, in the rebuilding trades. They raised families. They watched their country become something their wartime selves could not have imagined. Gabaldon himself maintained contact with parts of the Japanese community in ways that, in the post-war decades, crossed what had so recently been a line of absolute enmity. He was not unusual in this. Many Pacific veterans, on both sides, found that the men they had tried to kill were, in peace, simply men, but his particular history gave that reconciliation a texture different from the average veteran's. He had never entirely believed in the line to begin with. He had grown up on both sides of it simultaneously, in a neighborhood where the people who would become the enemy were his neighbors and his family's friends, and where the geography of loyalty was more complicated than any recruiting poster could represent. His relationship with Japan and with Japanese Americans deepened after the war. He spoke publicly about the injustice of the internment, the removal of the Nakano family, and hundreds of thousands of people like them, citizens and legal residents stripped of their property and their liberty by the same government that was simultaneously asking men like Gabaldon to fight and die on its behalf. He understood, with a clarity that perhaps only his particular biography could produce, that the country he served was capable of great courage and great injustice at the same time, and that acknowledging both was not contradiction but honesty. This, too, is part of the story. The caves at Saipan and what happened in them in the summer of 1944 do not exist in isolation from the camps at Manzanar and Tule Lake and the other inland prisons where Japanese Americans were held while their neighbors fought. Gabaldon's fluency in Japanese, the fluency that saved hundreds of lives, was a direct product of relationships that the United States government was, at that exact moment, classifying as threats to national security. The language that brought people out of the dark was learned in houses the government had emptied. History rarely offers its ironies in clean packages. This one comes in several layers simultaneously, and the deeper you look, the more layers there are. What remains constant through all of them is the morning itself, the heat, the limestone, the dark interior of the cave, a boy standing at the entrance, alone, calling in a language that connected two worlds that had spent 3 years trying to destroy each other. And the dark answered, "Thank you for watching." For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.